I'm Vincent Morfuni and welcome to this edition of Sono Calabrese, the Australian Calabrese Cultural Association program in which we have conversations with members of our community who can tell us about their experiences both here and in Italy. We're very honoured tonight to have as our guest Professor Anthony Tony Sofo, who's a PhD in mathematics and is an emeritus professor in mathematics at Victoria University. He has a fascinating story to tell, not only in terms of his personal achievement, but also in the family history that he discovered almost by accident when he returned to Italy on one occasion. Welcome, Tony, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. Yeah, okay. Welcome, Tony, and again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thank you. Now, you are a mathematician.
Yes, I guess that's one word. I guess I'm an educator, a mathematician, a researcher in mathematics. Yes, they're all combined.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. I take it that you were born in Calabria.
I was born in Gioia Tauro, in Calabria. I came here when I was in 1955, so I was, I think, 6, 7. So my initial recollections of Italy and Calabria are not great. I didn't have too many recollections at all.
Did you go to school in Calabria before you left?
Well, I believe I may have gone for some time, but I really don't remember a school. But I believe my mother may have sent me perhaps to keep me out of trouble, or because the youth of those days are pretty wild. But I do remember that my mother was telling me that there was a falegname close to us, a carpenter.
Carpenter, yeah.
And she used to send me there, I guess, to learn the trade or to keep out of trouble, I guess. So that's one thing that I clearly remember that my mother telling me when I was a young boy. But I do know that I got into a fair bit of trouble with the, well, nothing serious, just kid trouble as a young boy in Italy.
And your parents, were they also born in Gioia Tauro, or did they move there from somewhere else in Calabria?
Both of my parents are from Calabria. My dad was born in Rizziconi, which is about, I guess, 2 minutes from Cannava. So that's before he got married. When they got married, I believe that they moved to Gioia Tauro, which may be, I guess, a 15-minute donkey ride. In those days, it was a donkey ride or a bicycle ride. And I think the reason that they moved there was because my mother, who had lost her mother at an early age, had some sort of basic dwelling there. And I believe that they lived in that basic dwelling shortly after they got married. I do remember that dwelling because I did go back many years later. And of course, with lots of things that have happened over the years, the dwelling became dilapidated. No one was really using it. Nobody was paying any rates. So essentially it was a schmozzle, and I believe, as most things go, eventually the local council probably took it over.
Are you the oldest child in your family, or?
I am the second oldest. I have a older sister. I have two younger brothers. So we're essentially what you might call two lots of children, in the sense that my parents had four children in Italy. And then when they came to Australia a few years later, they had another set of three children. So there's seven children altogether, but four were born in Italy and much older than the three that were born here. In fact, between my oldest sister and my youngest sister, there is a difference of, I think, about 23, 23 years. Yes.
The whole generation almost, isn't it?
It's in fact, you're quite correct. That is a generation, yes.
And now, when did your parents marry?
My dad was in the army, and it's a bit of a story. I'm not sure if you want me to go into it.
Well, yes, tell us.
My dad was working essentially slave labor these days, you might call it, like his parents before him. They worked on a farm, I guess you can call it, that was growing basically olives. And they were producing oil basically for the gas lamps of Northern Europe.
And who owned the farm?
The farm was owned by, as I found out later, of course, I knew none of this until much, much later. And in that respect, I guess I should thank you in part, because you are the one that, in a sense, spurred me on to go back and learn more about my family in detail and learn exactly what they did and didn't do. So my paternal grandfather was born in Sant'Eufemia di Aspromonte, which is a mountain village, a very small mountain village. But for whatever reason, my grandfather moved from there to Cannava. I suspect it was basically the same reason that a lot of people moved, because life was difficult, food was difficult to get. So they moved, I guess, for a better life. So they moved to Cannava. My dad, I know not too much about his early life. In fact, I know nothing about his early life. I only know about my dad's life essentially from when he got conscripted into the army in 1939. So he was working on this farm that was owned by the Prince of, one of the Prince of Naples. And at that time it was Prince Acton. Now I remember as a young boy, one of my uncles talking about this farm and Prince Acton. And as a young boy, I thought this was a lot of baloney. You know, he's just making up stories and there's no truth to it. And maybe he's trying to inflate the truth. But it wasn't until much later that, in fact, he was right. That farm was owned by Prince of Naples, Prince Acton. And
he was British, wasn't he? Lord Acton was British.
Lord Acton was a Saxon prince, yes.
So they were absentee landlords, basically.
You're absolutely right. They essentially lived in Naples, but owned this land that was there to produce this oil that they could sell to the Northern Europeans. When he died, eventually the land was taken over by Principessa Maria Leonora di Leporano. And she is still alive. She is, I think, my age, round about my age. But her farm is now run by her two children. And the two children will be in their 40s, I guess, somewhere around there. So, yes, my dad worked there with his parents. But as I said before, I consider it, well, these days it's considered as slave labor. They weren't paid. They lived off the land. The story is that whatever they produced on the land, 50% went to the owners and they left with 50% for them to live. But that was life. That was not only...
And indeed, that was a typical arrangement, not just in Italy, but even in Ireland with absentee landlords, where they were essentially share farmers. And if it was a good year, they did well. If it was a poor year, they literally starved.
Absolutely.
Similar conditions, as you describe it, even in Colombia. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it was a very, very tough life. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, the house that they fabricated for them to live in was dirt floor. I mean, it wasn't a house that you and I might call a house. It was basically a dirt floor with maybe, if you're lucky, a bed, certainly no running water or toilet or anything of that sort.
So when did your father leave that farm and move away?
Well, I guess my dad would have stayed there if it wasn't for the war. It wasn't for World War II.
Right.
So my dad was conscripted in 1939. He reported for duty in 1939 to a particular captain there. And from there, he was part of the 67th Infantry. And I'm not sure where he was placed from 1939 onwards, but as far as I've been able to research, he certainly served in Albania. He certainly served in northern Italy, and I suspect he served in France as well.
He was single at the time that he was conscripted?
Pardon?
Was he single when he was conscripted?
Yes, he was, let me see, he would have been 19 before his 20th birthday. Yeah. He was single, he was conscripted, and dutifully went along and did his duties, as I guess most young men did in those days.
Yeah. How did he meet your mother?
Well, that was, I guess, in those days, and these days, I guess, coincidence, way of life, way of living. So my dad was serving in the army, and I guess he asked for or was given leave to go back home. So in the leave that he took to go back home, he had a friend in the army. And of course, they figured out that they were probably lived close by in Calabria, close by in towns. So this friend that my dad had in the army asked him if he would be so kind as to deliver a letter to his dad.
Who's your mother's father?
Which eventually turned out to be my mother's father. Of course, my dad said yes, he would do that for his friend. He would certainly deliver a letter. And so he delivered this letter to this particular person, Francesco. And of course, when he delivered this letter, I guess in and around the farm somewhere, he noticed a beautiful young lady. And I guess as we all are, when we see a young lady, we take some attention. My dad was somehow infatuated by the beautiful young lady that he'd met. So he delivered the letter, my dad delivered the letter and went back to his own parents, which was not far from where he delivered the letter, in Cannava. So it must have been, I'm surmising here, I'm just filling in the blanks. I'm surmising that he told my dad asked his mum and dad if they would go and ask this Francesco for permission to marry this young lady. And I guess, as you know, or people our age know, is that in those days, you certainly did not go up to a young lady and say, would you like to marry me? You certainly had to get an intermediary to do the negotiation with you, for you. So his mum and dad, my dad's mum and dad, my paternal grandparents, went to this Francesco and asked him for the permission of my father to marry his daughter. Well, it was the war. And I guess there's a lot of uncertainty in war. You know, how do you know you're going to live? How do you know you're going to come back alive? How do you know this? How do you know that? And so Francesca refused permission.
And how old would your mother have been at that time, you know?
Well, my dad let me figure this out. My mum would have been, I guess, 17, thereabouts. My dad may have been 22, thereabouts.
So he was told he had to wait until the end of the war, presumably.
So he was told by Francesca to go away, finish the war, and come back after the war, and we would consider what would happen.
Yeah.
Well, this was not not a suitable response for my father and I guess his parents. And in a sense, they insisted that they have some sort of answer. Well, Francesco refused to give an answer, said, go away, and within a few months, you will have an answer. Now, I'm not sure how he was going to get an answer within a few months because he went off to war. But in fact, he did get an answer within a few months. It was to the affirmative.
Right.
Now, of course, the answer that he got was, I mean, you couldn't send off a phone call in those days, or you couldn't get on the internet and send it off a phone call. So what I've been told is that my dad, who was stationed in northern Italy, got an answer from one of his future brother-in-laws who actually went to northern Italy by train. It must have taken him, I don't know how long, to find him where he was stationed and give him the good news that the answer was to the affirmative, that yes.
He went specifically to tell him what your grandfather had decided about the proposed marriage.
Yes, my grandfather had sent one of his children to locate, they knew where he was, and to give this response. So it was, to me, it was unbelievable because, I mean, during the war, you had to find your way to northern Italy, and who knows what was moving, what was traveling, what trains were going, not going. But eventually, my dad got the affirmation to marriage, which was, of course, great for him.
And what year did they marry?
So then, my dad, from 1942 to 1944, was stationed, as I said before, in various parts of Europe. And I guess I'm only surmising here that Dad must have asked for special permission to leave the army to marry. I guess. I don't have any proof of that, but I guess that's what must have happened, because what I do know that on the 28th of December 1944, he, my dad, Agostino, and his bride, Carmela, got married in Calabria.
But by that stage, Italy was no longer at war with the Allies, was it? Because it turned against the Germans. Was he still, was your father still fighting at that stage or not?
Yes, now that's a particular part of history which, of course, sometimes we don't learn or know about, is that Italy was in fact fighting with the Germans. And my dad was fighting, of course, on the side of Mussolini, on the side of Hitler, against the so-called aggressors, let's say. So what happened was that in 1943, I think in about September or thereabouts of 43, Italy declares that it no longer wants to be part of the war with Germany. So it actually surrenders. It surrenders to the Allies, and as you quite rightly said, starts to fight on the side of the Americans. And so my poor dad, and who knows how many others, you know, one minute they're firing the guns at one side, and the next minute they're firing the guns at the other side, because Italy had changed the sides. You know, they were now fighting with the Allies.
Yeah.
And at that time in 1943, I guess my dad, I'm not exactly sure what part of Europe he was in, whether he was in France or whether he was in northern Italy. But at one stage in 1943, I do know that he was in northern Italy. But to your question before, when did they get married? So my dad must have got special permission to leave. So he obviously gets this special permission, leaves, and goes back and marries in December 1944.
Yeah. And did he then have to return to the front, or did he stay?
Well, again, I don't have any hard evidence, but my suspicion is he would have had to return, because the war was not over yet. The war, as you know, ended in middle of 45. And so there's quite a few months to go. So where he actually went, I don't know. I'm not sure.
And I'll ask you, did your father ever talk about his wartime experiences, or were they, in a sense, so traumatic that he just didn't want to even talk about them?
Yes, there's a couple of answers to that. One answer is that as young children, we really don't take too much interest in our dad's personal lives. As a young boy, I really didn't ask questions about my dad's early life. I guess as young boys, we're probably as young girls as well, I guess we're more interested in our own self. You know, we're exploring, trying to find our own way. So I really didn't ask too many questions. But I do know that my dad talked about the war very, very sparingly. He didn't talk much about the war at all. In fact, and I suspect that is because he must have gone through some bad times, like a lot of people. But I do remember one story about the war that he used to recount in a funny way. I take after my dad. I have very little hair, and my dad was the same. So I do remember in a jovial way, we would talk and laugh, and he would always say that he lost his hair during the war. And of course, we'd ask, well, how did you lose your hair during the war? And he recounted that he was in Greece in the war. Now, I have not been able to find any evidence that he was in Greece, but of course that means nothing. So he says that during the war, they were in one particular really, really bad situation, that at one stage they were set upon by very, very heavy fire. And he recalls that a lot of his friends were just dropping dead, you know, from side to side. And he said that they were fleeing. And part of that fleeing, they had to cross over some water. And he recounts that in a funny way, that he couldn't swim. So as he was going through this water, he somehow submerged, and his friend next to him grabbed him by the hair and pulled him out of the water. And that's how he lost his hair.
A bit of a tall tale, I think, Tony.
I think a bit of a tall tale.
Nevertheless. And so after the war, your father and mother settled in Jaudaro?
Yes, after the war, my mother and father settled in Jaudaro. And I think, I have no hard evidence, but I think they must have worked the lands again of Principi.
Yeah.
But I think life must have been very, very hard, not just for my parents, but I think for a lot of people. The war had just finished. Everything was in chaos. Nobody had any money. Nobody had any food. Life was exceptionally difficult. In fact, I don't know how a lot of people from Southern Europe lived. It was extremely difficult. And living off the land, as you said before, you can have one good year and one bad year. But in my parents' case, the land wasn't theirs. They didn't have any land. So in a way, I guess it was more difficult. I guess if you actually owned land and worked your own land, I guess maybe, I'm not sure, things may have been a little bit easier. But I do know that life was exceptionally difficult. And if you had a bad year, then you just didn't eat, or you couldn't eat. And in fact, I do remember that my mother was saying that one particular year they had planted this field of chickpeas. And chickpeas is harvested in the summer. But particularly this summer was very, very dry and hot. And somehow or other, the chickpeas caught on fire. So they lost the entire crop of chickpeas. So, they had to make do with what they had. But life was extremely hard, as I say, for my mother and for many, many, many other people who returned from the war.
And how long did your father remain in Colombia before he migrated?
My dad, I think, tried to migrate fairly early after the war. And I think he first tried to migrate in 1951. So that's about 5-6 years after the war. That didn't come to fruition, I'm led to believe, because there was some mix-up in paperwork, and in 1951 there was also birth of his fourth child. So it was delayed. And that delay lasted, I think, for about 2 years. So eventually in 1953, my father got the ship. Of course, in those days.
And from what you said, he left his wife, your mother, and 4 children at that stage?
Yes, my dad left my mum, and at that stage, 4 children. And I can't imagine how desperately difficult it must have been, because
all right.
Sorry, Vince.
No, that's fine. Don't worry about it, Tony. I know it's an emotional thing, dredging it up. Because how old were you at the time?
In 1953, I was 5 years old.
Right. And do you have a recollection of your dad leaving?
No, I don't recall my dad leaving. And I do know that my mum said that it was very, very tough, because she didn't even have enough money to go to Messina. My dad left from Messina.
And that's in Sicily, obviously. So it would have meant taking the ferry from Calabria over to Messina to see him say farewell. Yeah. So your dad left alone, and with your mother and your siblings in the Paese. Were your grandparents still alive at that time?
My grandparents are still alive, but they couldn't go to Messina either. it was desperately difficult for them as well. And I do recall one occasion my dad saying how difficult it was for him to leave his parents, because his parents were of a certain age at that time, and he knew that he would probably not see them again.
And sadly, did he see them? I don't think he did see them again, did he? Yeah.
So he never saw his parents again. It was must have been exceptionally hard. But again, as I say, it wasn't just my own parents. It wasn't just my own dad. I think a lot of Calabrese went through a similar fate.
That's true. That's a common experience of migration. And how long did you remain in Colombia with your mother and siblings before you migrated to Australia?
So my dad eventually got to Melbourne in 1953. And I guess, as a lot of people did in those days, of course, before you could come, you have to have l'atto di richiamo. You had to have someone essentially
a sponsor
you. Yeah. And my dad had that. He had a brother-in-law here. And I guess that's where the sponsorship came from. So he got here in 1953, and he had a brother-in-law in Mini Ponds. So he lived with his brother-in-law for a little while in Mini Ponds.
And that's different to, because a lot of people came on what was known as assisted passage, where they didn't have to pay their fee or their fare, but then they were essentially indentured, I think, for 2 years from the day they landed, as a means of, and they would have to work to pay back the fare to the Australian government, which picked up the tab. So the advantage of having a sponsor is that you didn't need to go into the indentured workplace and be sent off wherever they thought there was work available. And I've spoken to people, for example, that came on assisted passages and they landed at Fremantle, and suddenly the next day they were shipped out into the countryside of WA, where they had to start clearing the bush.
Yes.
Whereas people like your father, who paid their own way, could go wherever they chose. So that's one advantage, I think. But, yeah.
Well, it is an advantage and perhaps a disadvantage. And there's also some discrimination, because I believe that those sort of programs were more in favour of, let's say, Northern Italians coming over, because I think the government somehow had a preference to Northerners rather than Southerners coming over. So in a sense, yes, it had that advantage, but of course it had the disadvantage that if you're unable to come up with the money, of course you couldn't move.
Yeah.
And I know that in my parents' case, that the way that it worked for them, and I guess for a lot of others, is that where do you get the money from? My dad didn't have any money. So what happened is that he had a brother-in-law living in Italy, and they came up with a plan. That the plan was that the brother-in-law in Italy who had a house would sell the house, give the money to my father for the passage. My father would come to Australia, start work, and send the money back to this brother-in-law, who he would then use for him to come over to Australia, which he did. That's the way it worked. And that's the way that my dad was able to come out. He essentially had to get a loan. He had to work the loan off and pay it back. There was no money for him and a lot of Italians in those days. So yes, there was some advantage, as you say, but in a sense, it was also not an advantage. If you couldn't get the money, you were stuck. You couldn't move. You had to stay there.
Predicated on being able to raise the cost of the
yes,
but otherwise,
yeah.
So your dad lands in Melbourne, goes to Moonee Ponds, I think you said, and lives with
Yes.
with his brother-in-law, your uncle.
Yes, so lands in Melbourne. He gets picked up from Station Pier, is taken to Moonee Ponds, lives with his brother-in-law, and according to folklore, starts work the next day. How lucky is he?
Well, well, in a way, he was lucky. I don't know if you know, but people who arrived here in 1951, when there was an economic recession, they couldn't find work for a while. And unlike now, so I'm told by people who went through it, the social security
non-existent.
was non-existent. So
Absolutely.
they were literally dependent on whoever sponsored them or other relatives, if they had them, to maintain them until they were able to get a job. But yeah,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
So in a way, I guess he was lucky he was delayed a couple of years because certainly as soon as he came to Australia, he found work straight away. And as I say, in that couple of years, he managed to save up enough money and send money back to his brother-in-law and also, I guess, send money back to my mother because his wife, because I don't know how on earth we could have lived without that assistance.
Yeah, and I'm interested in the period when your father was in Australia and you were still in Colombia with your mother and siblings. When did you realise that the absence of your father is what I'm asking? You said you didn't even know that he was leaving. When did his absence really hit you?
Well, I guess in my case, I may have been perhaps a little bit too young to sort of notice the absence, because I really can't say that there's a specific day or event that makes me sit up and say, oh, where's my dad? So I don't really have a specific idea. Maybe I was too young. Same as school. I think I went to school for some period, but I don't really recall going to school. All I can really remember is getting into a lot of trouble. Not serious trouble, kids' trouble. You know, in the sense that it must have been very difficult for my mother to let's say control 3 boys and 1 girl.
And a far cry from the, you know, placid university professor you would have become.
Some people say I'm still out of control.
So did when your mother and yourself and your siblings arrived, did you also go to live in Moonee Ponds with your uncle? Or?
Yes. We left also from Messina in 1955. And again, I only have vague and minor recollections. I do remember the 1 month long boat trip, mainly because I got up to mischief again. But I do remember that. I don't remember actually leaving Messina, but I do remember going through some sort of port, which I later found out was through the Suez Canal, of looking at these strange bits of fruit that were long and yellow that I'd never ever seen before. And as I found out later, they were bananas. But the problem was that my mother didn't have any money to even buy us bananas. So there was some, according to my mother, there was some kind lady there close by that apparently bought bananas for us. And that was the first time that I remember tasting a banana. And boy, were they nice. So yes, back to your question, we left Italy in 1955 and arrived here a month later. We left also from Messina. So when we arrived at in Port Melbourne, Station Pier, as I guess in those days everybody arrived there, we must have had somebody to come and pick us up, I guess, my father and my uncles. And I do remember going back and living for a short while in this shared house, let's say in Moonee Ponds, with my uncle, because he had his family here as well. And my uncle had 3 children as well.
So how many people were living in the house?
Well, at that stage, we were sharing with my uncle, and there were 7 children and 4 parents. And we lived in the Moonee Ponds house for a short while, but that became a little bit, I guess, hectic. So we moved out into another share house, also in Moonee Ponds, but we went further down to George Street in Moonee Ponds, and there we lived again in a shared house with one of our cousins who also had 3 children and 2 parents, and my 2 parents and us 4 children. So we lived in George Street, Moonee Ponds for, I guess, a couple of years, and it was there that I do recall going to the Moonee Ponds West State School.
Do you recall your first day at school in Australia?
Not the first day, no, I don't recall.
Did you speak English at that time or not? No.
Of course not. I don't know what I did at my first day at school. I must have been like an alien, I guess. But I don't remember the first day at school, no. But I do remember going to Moonee Ponds West Primary School, and I do remember again, it seems to be my life story, getting into a lot of fights with the young kids my age.
Yeah. Do you recall what was the cause of the fights?
I don't recall initially what the fights were about, but later on I do remember there was a lot of name calling, wog this and wog that, and I guess I must have learned the lingo pretty quickly, because I'd learned that wog was a bad word. And I guess I must have taken some exception. So yes, wog was not a very nice word in those days.
Well, it certainly wasn't a compliment, was it?
No. Yeah.
So how long did you stay at that school?
So that was 1955, and I guess we stayed there 1, maybe 2 years. Yeah, it wasn't.
And where did you go then?
So we stayed there for a short while, and I guess with a lot of migrants, they wanted to buy the. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I needed.
No, that's fine.
Needed a drink. Sorry.
And I guess with a lot of migrants, they knew what they wanted. They knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to buy their own house. They didn't want to pay rent. To them, it was money that was wasted. So my mum and dad worked very, very hard, and they managed to scrape up some sort of deposit. And we then, or my parents then purchased a house in Dongola Road in West Footscray. So we moved to Dongola Road in West Footscray, and this was a wooden house, run down, a very, very large block. But it was a pride and joy. It was something that my mum and dad had bought, and come whatever, they were going to pay this house off, and this is where they were going to raise their family, and that's what they did. My mum and dad bought this house. In fact, I can still remember the price. It was £5,000 in West Footscray. And the reason why I remember is because, as I said, mum and dad bought this house with a deposit, and they paid I think it was a weekly or fortnightly payment to the owner of the house that they'd bought the house from. And the owner chose to, I guess, let my mum and dad pay this house off in installments. It wasn't a typical bank loan as you might have today, but
what's known as a
yeah, I'm not sure.
Contract. Yeah.
Yes, and I remember once in a while my dad giving me an envelope and instructing me to take it to such and such a place to pay the mortgage. But it was their pride and joy. It was a house that they loved. It was a house that we lived in as young children, and it was a house that that was very, very happy. We had some very, very happy times in that house.
Moving house, that would have meant that you would have had to move schools as well.
So I went from one state school that was infamous for whatever reason to another state school that was also infamous for whatever reason, because West Footscray primary school in those days was also pretty rough. And again, knowing my luck, I managed to get into more fights. But by then I knew the lingo. So it was quite a different story, because knowing the lingo put you to an advantage, and I was able to swear back at them, and I was able to fight back as well.
And did you play sport?
I'm not sure that I remember playing organised sport at primary school, but I guess I remember mucking around in the schoolyard. I can't actually recall organised sport at primary school. So I'm not.
Were your siblings at the same school, or were they in different schools?
No, I was the black sheep of the family, because my siblings all went to Catholic schools. But I don't understand why, and I'm not sure why. Maybe because, sorry, I take that back. My sister also went to state school. She went to the girls' secondary school in Footscray. But I went to primary school at West Footscray, which was not a Catholic school. And then from there, I moved on to, again, not a Catholic school. I went to Tottenham Technical School, which was renowned for its roughness.
Yeah, I can vouch for that, having played football against some of their students. So tell me, educationally, what was your ambition at that time?
Well, I don't know, to be honest. At primary school, I guess I must have been average or less than average at school. I don't remember anything in particular that stands out. I guess my English initially must have been bad, so I was probably not a good English student. So I really don't recollect having ambitions of one thing or another. But I do recollect that my parents always bestowed on us the fact that we had to work hard and that education was extremely important. And as children, of course, you listen, but most things go over your head, you know, you don't really take too much notice. So yes, I listened to what my parents said. I appreciated what they said, but at primary school, it didn't mean anything to me.
Right. What about secondary school?
Well, secondary school, again, initially in Form 1 as it was, because the school that I'd went to was a school, let's say, for the trades, where you essentially went to learn the trades, I guess it wasn't really an academic type of school in the sense that academia was forefront in their mind. So in my early years of primary school, I remember doing a lot of woodwork, a lot of sheet metal work, etc., a lot of technical drawing, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed all of those things. But later on in year 8 and 9, I do recall that I started liking some of the science subjects. For whatever reason, I don't know why, I started to like them more and more. And when I started to learn some simple things like Pythagoras' theorem, I was blown out of the world. You know, here's a theorem that, wow, what can it do? And I started having a liking for these mathematical things. So yes, perhaps towards the end of technical school, I became a little bit more education-wise, let's say, but I still had no plans of being this or that or the other. I just went along with the flow, I guess.
And how long did you stay at Tottenham Tech?
Well, unfortunately, and to my regret, I guess, and to my parents' regret, I left at the end of year 9.
Why did you leave?
I left for a number of reasons. One reason that I left, that in my family was very, very difficult. My mum and dad were struggling financially, and it was tough, very, very hard.
They were both working?
Well, at this stage, my parents started to have a second family, so my mum, of course, wasn't working.
So there was only a dad's wage?
Yes.
And how many children were there by this stage?
Well, by this stage, there were 7 children.
Right.
And so it was very, very difficult because my dad, of course, didn't have a trade. So he was always employed, but it was a labourer's wage. So let's say it was difficult. So for whatever reason, and I don't really know why myself, I guess being stupid is a good answer.
Or maybe it was being a good son and accepting a responsibility that you had to contribute to the family resources.
I don't know, but let's say it's stupidity. So I left at the end of year 9, and all I could do was that I had these technical drawings that I'd done at school, because we had to do technical drawing at school. I had nothing else. So I took them along to an engineering company in Altona and begged and asked for a job. I guess the person there must have thought that I was stupid, but alarm and behold, he said, yes, okay, you can start as a junior. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I found out that they had an engineering fabrication facility that was constructing equipment for the petrochemical industry, and they made all of their technical drawings. They had a technical drawing department, and I think he must have thought that he could use me in the technical drawing department. And sure enough, I was a junior in that department. Well, let me say it was a department of 2 people, me that swept the floor and somebody else that did all the technical stuff. But nonetheless, he was good enough to give me a job.
And how long did you stay in that job?
Well, I actually loved the job. I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that my boss, the chief engineer there, must have obtained some information from Totty Tech, where I went, and must have found out that I was a fairly capable sort of student. So my boss suggested to me if I'd like to go to school, and I jumped. I said yes. I thought, wow, I don't have to work. I can go to school. So my boss drove me to one evening, or one day actually, drove me to Footscray Technical College, as it was in those days, in Ballarat Road, West Footscray, and promptly enrolled me into school. The only problem was that I found out that it was school, of course, but it was 4 nights a week. I said, bloody hell, 4 nights a week. Yes, 4 nights a week from 5:30 to 9:30.
So you'd work all day, and
so
then on 4 nights you go to school. So
I worked until 4:30, and I had an hour to get from Altona to Footscray, 2 buses, and start night school at 5:30. So I had two 2-hour classes. I had 5:30 to 7:30, and then a 7:30 to 9:30. And then at 9:30, when I finished, of course, I was too young to drive, so I had to walk home. It was a three-quarter hour walk from Footscray Tech to my home. So I usually got home about 9:45. By that time, I was tired, had something to eat, which my mum was exceptionally good, always had some nice hot warm meals for me at night, and tucked into bed, and off I went the next day.
That's good. And ultimately, that stage they were giving diplomas. That's great.
At that stage, not yet.
No.
In 1964, there was still a technical school, and in fact, the Advanced College of Footscray was at the Nicholson Street campus. That's where they were offering the diplomas. So the Nicholson Street campus were offering diplomas, and the Footscray campus was a secondary school. It was Footscray Technical School College.
Effectively, you were completing your high school education at Footscray.
Yes, I completed year 10 and year 11, and my boss was very pleased with me that I'd actually completed year 10 and year 11, and managed to get some good grades, and he was exceptionally proud of me, and I managed to get a bonus at the end of at the end of that year.
That's good. And what about year 12? Did you complete year 12?
Well, that was another shock surprise, I guess you might call it. I didn't know much about school, and I didn't know much about progression. I didn't know much about universities. So I liked what I was doing, and I hoped to progress to further studies. But I had no knowledge whatsoever that there was this dichotomy of, on one hand, you had technical schools that were essentially for the trades, and on the other hand, you had high schools that were essentially for people who wanted to move on and go on to university and further study. So at the end of my year 11, I hoped to go on to further study, but a couple of things happened. First of all, the education department changed entry into higher education from year 11 to year 12. Initially, you could get into university and higher education with year 11, but they changed that. But another shock was the fact that nobody would take me at university because here I was a black sheep. I'd come from a technical college. So,
I think that illustrates, though, one of the other real disadvantages of migrant families, and in that the absence of mentoring, right, and the lack of knowledge about the educational system, as you say, because from what you're telling us, literally, other than the boss who took you to the tech school, Footscray Tech, no one explained to you, you know, indeed, from what you're telling me, no one even asked you, you know, where do you hope to be? once you finish your education, and so you stumble along.
I stumbled along, making many mistakes.
Well, and that's not, surprising, really, given. And I've got to say, in a way, you're not alone in that. I think a lot of people at your similar vintage would have gone through the same process, unless they had parents who was much more attuned to the educational system, or they were lucky to be living in areas where other people could advise their parents. But so you clearly you would have preferred to go to university at that stage.
Well, for Italians, l'università was the place to go.
Yeah.
My parents encouraged education, but in all honesty, they wouldn't know one school from another school. My mum was illiterate. My dad, of course, was not. He could read and write, but he was dedicated to his family, wanted to see his family do well, and he said to us, whatever you want to do, you can do. In fact, a lot of my cousins ended up in businesses and other ventures. From my entire family, cousins and all, we're the only ones that have higher education, that sense with a PhD. So I didn't know either. I had no idea myself. But it all boiled down to the fact that I could only get into one place. So that's where I went. I went to RMIT. It was the only place that could take me.
And that was, again, in the days before it became a university, the RMIT.
Yes, that was Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. It was not quite yet a university, but it was offering diplomas and degrees. And that's
What did you study there?
Well, I enrolled in the Bachelor of Science because at this stage, my things that I liked to do was more science and engineering. I still love my engineering. I was doing well, but I moved a little bit more to the science and mathematics. So I ended up doing a mathematics degree.
And your engineering had taken you to different places in work, hadn't they? You tell us, where did you work? What places did you work at?
I'd worked at Fab Steam Engineering in Altona, and I must say, to their credit, they're exceptionally good and kind to me. I loved what I did, and they appreciated me because I was doing okay. But again, for no particular reason whatsoever, I decided to leave Fab Steam. And my boss was very disappointed that I was leaving because he'd seen something in me that I didn't see. And I guess, again, the stupidity of the youth, I decided to leave, and I went and worked for Humes. Humes is a very, very large construction industry in both steel construction and more commonly known for concrete pipes. So I got a job in the city at alarm and behold, you wouldn't believe it, the Owen Dixon Chambers. They had an office there. So I worked in the office at Owen Dixon Chambers. Again, very happy working along, and I really enjoyed what I did. And my bosses again there were.
What year is this that you're working at Owen Dixon?
So this was in 1968, thereabouts, and I worked there until beginning of 74, 73, 74. And I was doing well. I was enjoying my job. I loved what I was doing. I was becoming a little bit more senior. By that stage, I'd had my degree, and I was becoming more and more interested in mathematics. So I was doing a little bit of design work. I'd worked on some really, really great projects, really fabulous projects. But I was getting to the stage where, just for people who may know, when you design, say, a heat exchanger or a boiler, you've got to adhere to certain rules and regulations. And so, for example, to work out the thickness of steel that you might need for a certain boiler, you go to a certain code, you pluck out a certain equation and you put the numbers in, and out comes an answer. Well, I was a bit more involved, and I said, well, why do I have to use that equation? Where does that equation come from? So a lot of the engineers couldn't answer that, and I couldn't answer it, but it meant more and more development into mathematics. It came from concepts of mathematics. And so that's when I started to move more and more to the mathematical field. I then became more and more interested in mathematics, and it took me in a different path.
And just to digress a little, what about in terms of social life? What were you doing at that time?
Well, my social life was non-existent by that stage. As a young boy, I think I was about 17, thereabouts. Apart from my studies, I joined the local rock band in 5th grade.
And I can see that you've still got guitars there in the background.
I still have my guitars there, which I don't play at all, or very little these days. So I joined the local rock band, and I played in rock band for a number of years. But of course, when my studies got serious, I had to make a decision. I had to either do one or the other, because I couldn't do the three things properly. I work, play in a rock band, and my studies were serious. So I gave up the playing in the rock band, and I concentrated more and more on my studies. But my social life would not existent at that stage, because unfortunately tragedy struck our family in 1972, and my father passed away.
Had he been ill for a little while?
Yes, he'd been ill for a little while, and we hoped that it wouldn't be bad, but as it turned out, he had cancer. Cancer was terminal, and we were told in no uncertain way that he had 6 months to live, and it's exactly what happened. He had 6 months, and unfortunately he died. My mum was devastated. We're all devastated. Life was hard.
And how old were you then?
I was 23
Right.
at that stage. And excuse me, I was devastated. But my devastation was nothing compared to my mum's devastation. It was.
Did your mother know about your father's illness?
My mum certainly knew that my dad was ill, but there was a strange set of circumstances. On the day of the operation, I'll never forget, my dad was operated on, and at a clinic in Moonee Ponds, and I was there, and my uncles were there at the operation. Of course, my mum had young children, so she wasn't there. So at the end of the operation, the doctors came out of the operating theatre, stood in front of me and my uncles, and just like night and day said, your dad's got 6 months to live. Well, you can imagine, you know, how we all felt. But at that stage, my uncles decided, and they told me that it would be best if we kept this to ourselves and not tell my mother that my dad had 6 months to live. They thought it would be better simply to tell my mother that my dad was sick. And, you know, having older uncles and being young, I didn't like it, but I went along with it. I just said yes, okay. So no, my mum didn't know definitively that my dad was going to die, but obviously as the days got closer, it became evident. And yes, when my mum died, when my dad died, my mother was absolutely devastated. The entire family was devastated. And my mum still had 3 young siblings at home, 3 young children. And you can only imagine how tough it was for her to move. And I must say, I hated Italian values and Italian customs and Italian life and everything.
I want to ask you about that. What was it, do you think, that caused you to, as it were, rebel against the culture, basically, I suppose, in your youth?
Well, as a young boy, I guess you always rebel at everything, no matter what it is. But I guess as a young boy in a new country with different customs, it's even tougher because Italian customs were completely different than Australian customs. And I wanted to be part of the youth of Australia, and I couldn't be because we had different customs. We were not allowed out. We had to stay home. We had to do our doveri. As you know, we had to go to Olutto. We had to go to arranged marriages. We had to do the lot. And these were things that my friends were not doing. And of course I rebelled. I was a young boy. Whether they were right or wrong didn't matter. I had to rebel. So I rebelled in that. And as a young boy...
When you say you rebelled, was really a means of achieving acceptance from, you know, your Australian mates? Because I would imagine there would have been a lot of socialising within the family, but not much beyond the extended family.
Well, I don't think we had any Australian friends apart from the next door neighbour. I certainly, playing in the band, I certainly had a lot of young friends and people, but there were things that just sort of kept.
Who were the other band members?
Oh, there were local boys from Footscray. One was an Englishman and 2 other young Australian boys, and we were very good mates. We were very good, and we all played together. But my personal family life was separate to that. So it wasn't something that they got involved in. So I was, you know, against all that sort of thing. But, you know, there are things that I rebelled against, and I probably did some things that I shouldn't have done. But my sister, of course, would not have rebelled and did not rebel. And she accepted all the customs, and she got her first marriage proposal by way of an arrangement. That's the way it worked. I don't know about all Italians, but it certainly worked amongst us Southern Calabrese at that time. So that's what happened with my sister. She got a marriage proposal. The first one didn't work out for whatever reason, but a second proposal certainly came along, and that was successful, and she married the man that she loved and the man of her dreams, and they were exceptionally happy. But to go back to my mum was at that stage, my sister was married, of course, but we'd lost our dad at that stage. My mum was devastated. So I had no social life in that sense, that I devoted my life, and I wanted to helping my mum. That's what that I felt that I should do, and I did, and I didn't bemoan it. I loved it, and even the Luther, sorry, Vince, even the Luther that we had, all of a sudden, here's me against Italian things. I thought, gee, this is something that is actually quite soothing for especially my mother. I started to change my ideas and my values.
Well, one of the things, the luta, what it actually does, it draws the family together as a support base for whoever has lost a partner or whoever. And that's one of the good things, I think, about families. And, and that's why I think the family, or the concept of the family, is so important, not just in Calabrese culture, but even in Italian culture. That ultimately, one can always rest assured that there's support there. If it's not one member, it'll be another. Whereas, without that cultural aspect, that there may not be. But so gradually, then you turned against the rebellion and veered towards the Calabrese culture once more.
Well, I veered in the sense that I became more accepting. I don't think I did the Calabrese thing in the sense that I became in favour of arranged marriages, etc., etc. In that strict sense.
Marriage at that time, because you were 23, I think you said.
Well, I was 23 at that stage, and I'd never thought seriously of getting married. I was very happy in what I was doing, and I knew that one day I would probably get married. But
and did you think you'd marry an Italian?
No, I was against marrying Italians.
Why is that?
Well, because that sort of thing didn't suit me. And I guess there was still a little bit of rebellion. But there's arranged and arranged marriages, and some people think that arranged marriages are forced. And certainly in my sister's case, there was no forcing at all. It was mutual agreement. In fact, the first one didn't work out. So in that sense, an arrangement can be good. But I guess I was probably influenced by Elvis Presley and the Hollywood style, that you go out and you meet someone.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say probably playing in the rock band and having all these groupies that, clamoring at you.
Well, playing in the rock band was very nice, and yes, and you always had some sort of attention. And I did have girlfriends, but girlfriends not in the sense that I'd ever contemplated marriage in that sense. As I said, I was happy doing what I was doing, and I knew that one day I was going to get married, but I didn't want an introduction to marriage, put it that way. I wanted to marry in my style of perhaps meeting someone that I fell in love with and she fell in love with me, and then we could get married that way. Not that it was necessarily better than an arrangement, an unforced arrangement, but it was
you didn't think that would happen with an Italian girl, did you?
No, I'd taken that out of my mind. There's no way I was going to marry an Italian girl. That was gone. It was gone. I was going to marry some Footscray girl, probably. I don't know. But as luck or chance, as luck or chance would happen, it did happen. I married an Italian girl, a very beautiful Italian girl.
How did you meet your wife?
Well, again, the marriage was, the meeting was fortuitous in that sense, that 1972 was a really tragic year for us as a family. Not only had I lost my dad, but I'd lost my first cousin and my father's brother, my uncle, that year. 3 in the space of 6 months. I mean, can't imagine how horrible it was for us. It was absolutely terrible year for my mother, for us as a family, and things just never seemed to, bad things never seemed to end. So things were going along smoothly, and I wasn't going out at all. I wasn't really meeting people. Basically, Saturdays, we'd hop into my car, my broken down car, and we'd go to the cemetery and say a few prayers and clean the tomb and etc. That was my life. But we also had a connection with the St. Joseph Parish in West Brunswick, and there was supposed to be a barbecue there, and I was invited to a barbecue, and I went along.
What was the connection? You're living in West Footscray, and presumably there's a local Catholic church.
Yes, what happened was that our priest moved from one to the other, so we essentially, well, not followed the priest, but we still had connections there. And so we had these connections. So we went there, and I went along to the barbecue, and I'm sitting there having fun, and I look around, and there's this beautiful young lady. Yeah, and I said, oh my God, she's so beautiful. I've got to talk to her. So I went over.
Did you think she was Italian when you first saw her?
No, well, no. I didn't think she was Italian, but I mean, you know, my my expertise on girls wasn't that great, so I probably couldn't tell who was Italian, who was not. But in any case, I thought there's a beautiful young lady there. I'll go and have a talk. So I moved over. We spoke together, and alarm and behold, I was blown over. But of course, I found out she was Italian, and I thought, well, that's it. I've blown it again. I've blown it again. That's the end of it. But because I'd grown, I guess, so fond of her in that sense, the day after, I get a telephone call inviting me to somebody's birthday. And I'd found that this birthday was of this particular young lady that I'd met, if I'd like to go. So I went along, had a fabulous time, and I kept looking at this young lady and kept saying, my God, she's beautiful. So the day after I rang her, I don't know why, because Italian girls are still, you know, pretty strict and not allowed out and all this sort of thing. So I suggested we might meet for coffee. She said yes, that could happen. So we ended up meeting at Genevieve's for coffee at our favourite haunt in Carlton in those days.
Must have been nearly every student's favourite.
I think so. You probably would have had a cup of coffee or two there.
Yeah, I did. All right, and so, and ultimately you married.
Yes, a couple of things happened. I'd met this young lady in 1972.
Well, you can tell us her name.
Luciana.
Yeah.
Luciana. But of course, when we met in, well, let's say secretly. I certainly couldn't rock around to her place and say, here I am, I'm her boyfriend. They were still Italians. We still had these customs. She's not Calabrese, but nonetheless, you know, Italians still had those customs, you know. It wasn't so much that they're afraid of themselves, but the Italians are afraid more those days of what would other people say. And I guess that was part of their thinking. So we went out for quite a while, and eventually I proposed. And at that stage, well, I said, well, I've got to come around. So I came around and met the family. And at that stage, I'd met only the father, because the mother at that stage, fortuitously, I guess, was away in Italy for 6 months.
Oh.
So I was allowed to stay and visit. So I visited once a week, and I got to know the father very, very well. And I guess in a sense, the father became a surrogate father to me, who I'd lost. And we started talking, we started getting to know each other, and eventually we married in 1974. But what I'd found out about my future father-in-law, we were talking that he was a musician as well. And I was half a musician, let's say. So we clicked very, very well. We would have long discussions, and he was a brilliant musician. He played for the Neapolitan String Quartet.
All right.
He played the mandolin. So when he came to Australia, he started up his own orchestra and played in Melbourne. And he played a lot of weddings. And I said to him one day, I said, perhaps you would have played at such and such a wedding in Maidstone. He said, I said, well, I don't know. He said, I've played in so many weddings, I wouldn't have an idea of who I played for.
Yeah.
I said, what was the name of your band? He said, oh, such and such a wedding, such and such a band. Oh, I said, okay. Now, to go back a bit, when my sister got married, bands in those days had a half an hour break in which they would sit down and have their meal. So when they had that half an hour break, I went up to the band leader, his name is Maestro Ruggiero, and I asked the band leader, do you mind if we play for half an hour while you have a break? And he said no. So he permitted us to play. So my band and I got up and we played a few songs for that half an hour. I duly thanked the bandmaster and we sat down and they continued playing. But what happened was that, of course, they'd taken photos and videos, etc., of us playing. So to go back to later on, when I'd started going around to the place of Luciana's place, where her father was, that I got to know well, he told me the name of the band. I went to my sister. I said, do you have any photos? She brought the photos out. Alarm and behold, there is this Maestro Ruggiero was playing at my sister's wedding. And I had met him, shaking his hand.
And you got permission to play.
I got permission to play. So here am I with him in the same video that my sister has. There's a photo of me and him and my parents as well. And of course, by that stage, my father had died, so my new parents-in-law didn't know my father. But here is a photo and a video of myself, my future father-in-law, and my father, who was still alive at that stage. Anyway, to cut to the chase, we got married in 1974. And 1974 was also the year that I had a career change. I had known a friend who knew that I was interested in mathematics, and he knew somebody in Altona North that needed maths teachers. He decided to ask me if I wanted to go teach mathematics. I was reluctant, yes and no. I did like maths, but I loved my job that I was doing. But for some other stupid reason, I don't know why, I said, okay, let's throw caution to the wind. So I accepted the maths job. I took up a position of teaching maths at Altona North Secondary School.
Well, when an adventure.
Well, adventure, I'd call it a shock. I started teaching. It was a high school. Well, it didn't take me long to realize it was not for me. I was totally unsuited, let's say, to teaching the secondary school children. It was basically, for me, it was child minding, I guess. I was not up to it.
Or was it, you know, a lack of interest on the part of the students that really mitigated against you being effective?
Well, I guess I'd been in industry for about, 8-10 years, and I was used to working cooperatively with people, negotiating, expertly communicating. People were there because they had to be there, and they did what they did because they loved what I did. But when I went into into secondary school, well, young kids are young kids. They like to play up. They like to muck around. Learning is secondary to them. And it wasn't my ideal way of teaching. I didn't know how to handle it, essentially. I enrolled in a Diploma of Education at Melbourne Uni. I got a hell of a lot of theory, but it did very little for me. I learned a lot about everything, but it did little for me. So I left. I realised that it wasn't something that I wanted to do. So at the end of the year, I left, and I really had no job. So I decided to go back to industry. Well, again, I guess fate stepped in. I noticed a job that was advertised at RMIT. I put in my application, forgot about it. Sometime later, I get a letter of offer if I'd like to take the job. I jumped. I said, yes, I'll take it. So I took the job at RMIT, and it was lecturing mathematics, but it was to at that stage, they had what they called TOP year, tertiary orientation year, which I took, I accepted, and I enjoyed it. I loved doing that sort of work.
And did you continue your own education in terms of qualifications?
Yes, I still had a love of mathematics, and I decided that I should try and learn some more, become better educated. So I took on a master's degree part-time. I finished that and got a master's degree in pure mathematics, and I enjoyed that as well. And I enjoyed my my job. And again, as would have it, fate stepped in. I was able to get a lectureship job at Victoria University. Again, I became more interested in mathematics, so I enrolled in a PhD, and alarm and behold, I ended up with a PhD some 4 years later.
And what year did you finish your PhD?
Well, I was older than the average, put it that way. So I was
Not surprising.
An older student. In fact, my wife suspected I might have had a lover, because many times at midnight I would get up and write my ideas on paper. I had to get up because if I'd had an idea, I had to write it down. And yes, but lucky my wife was very supportive, and I was very lucky. I dedicated my PhD to my mother. My mother was, although she couldn't read or write, she was very supportive and very eager that we all got an education.
And what was the thesis of your PhD?
The thesis was in mathematics, of course. It was applied mathematics, and specifically, it's an area of mathematics that's called applied mathematics. It advanced some of the theories that a particular mathematician in the 17th century by the name of Euler had started, and also advanced some of the theories that a relatively modern mathematician by the name of Ramanujan advanced as well. So yes, it was in that area, an area which I still work in today.
Right. And you continued at Victoria University, is that right?
Yes, I continued at Victoria University. I guess I was employed initially, let's say, as an expert teacher, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. But universities or universities technologies as well, let's go back a bit. Firstly, some of these were called Institutes of Advanced Technology. So it was Footscray Institute of Technology, Swinburne Institute, RMIT, etc. They eventually became known as University of Technologies, and later on they became known as universities. So initially the Institute of Technologies offered degrees and masters, and then later on they offered PhD programs. So initially I was basically into teaching. Then later on, as they changed their focus, I also changed my focus and went more into research.
Now, I know you're modest, but in fact, your publication list is fairly extensive. And if anyone is interested, they can look it up at researchgate.net profile Anthony Sofo, or at bmath.org, *Q equals Sofo. And you've written books and chapters in books and I don't know how many articles. Where do you find the time?
Well, I guess it's a love, like anybody has a love. You know, they love to do things and they do it. I guess I'm lucky, I guess, that I like doing what I'm doing. I'm still an honorary professor at university, so I still have the opportunity to use the library and look at journals, etc. So I love doing it. To me, it's, I guess, not a chore, and I'm lucky enough that I get approached from people around the world, and I've been lucky enough to write papers with people from many, many countries, and that's part of the collaboration that I like.
And you've been visiting fellow at a number of academic institutions, haven't you? Well,
yes.
Whereabouts?
Well, I've been lucky enough to be invited to a number of institutions throughout the world, and one of the ones that I've always wanted to visit and take part of is I was lucky enough to visit Cambridge one year, and I became exceptionally emotional there because I guess to a certain extent it's a seat of knowledge, Cambridge. But I then wanted to go to a place of a particular person who I admired very much, and that was Galileo. So I decided to try and see if I can spend some time in Pisa, where Galileo had been. So I was fortunate enough to spend about 7 months with my family as a visiting research fellow in the mathematics department at the university in Pisa. And I loved it very, very much. It was an absolute delight. It was delight in many ways. One way, of course, that I did do some research, but in another way, it was delightful for my family as well, to see them grow and appreciate another culture. And they learned, let's say, Italian in the proper way, because my way is Calabrese way. So yes, my children also went to school there, and in fact, they speak Italian much better than I do. So I was fortunate enough to spend some time there, and I've also spent times in other parts of the world. Well, let's say a few other places around the world that I've enjoyed as well. But it's been for me a very, very lucky, I guess, ride to be able to have this opportunity to go to these places and work with those people.
Yeah, well, I think it's more than luck, Tony. I think it's recognition of your obvious ability, and again, you're displaying modesty that is charming. But now I've got to ask you, as I understand it, you're a distant relation to Joe Avatia, you know.
Yes, we are. Let me put the light on. It might be a bit dark.
Yeah, okay, it's getting a bit dark there.
Is that a bit better?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the room's a bit dark. Sorry. What's the connection?
Well, yes, we are distant relations. There's a long story and short story. I'm not sure how much time you have. I'm willing to go back at the start and tell you the long story, but otherwise I can just say that, yes, we're related. But
give us a long story, because I think it's an interesting story. So.
Well, to go back to the war, as I mentioned before, my dad was in the war, and it appears that sometime during the war, my dad may have been injured or perhaps sick, and and spend some time perhaps in hospital. So what happened was that in June of 2000, I was invited to give a lecture at the University of Calabria in the mathematics department. At that stage, it was in Gioia. I believe now it's moved to Cosenza. So I went along and I gave my lecture. I'd gone from Vienna I'd had another lecture in Vienna to give, and I went from there to Joy. Now, Joy, of course, to Reggio Calabria, which is close to Gioia Tauro, and Gioia Tauro is where I was born. Now, in Gioia Tauro, of course, we had relatives. All the relatives have moved either to northern Italy or to Australia or other parts of the world. But I knew that one of my uncles would be there in June of that year, because he still maintained his house in Gioia Tauro. So I got in touch with the family and asked if we could meet in June. He said, sure, he'd love that. So in June, I went and was duly treated by the maths department there in a very hospitable way. Then one evening I went and saw my uncle. Now, this is my uncle by the name of Uncle Rocco, who had spent time with my father in the war before they were married, before they were both married. So we had a really, really lovely time, and he was just talk about all the experiences. My head was spinning, you know, with all the stories he was telling me, stories I'd never heard before. It was a fabulous night. Anyway, as I'm about to leave, I said to my uncle in a throwaway line, I said, look, I said, you've spent time with my father and you're both in the war together, and after the war you were together. By any chance, would you have any memorabilia, letters, or anything of that sort? He said, I'm just about out the door now. I said, oh, he said, look, he said, come back tomorrow night. I'll have a look, see what I can find. And I said, what? So anyway, to cut a long story short, I turned up the other night. We had another fabulous night. It was getting very late. I said to my uncle, please, I said, did you find anything? Did you have anything? He said, hang on a minute, wait here. He goes into another room, comes back, brings an envelope, hands me an envelope and says, here you are, this is for you, you can have it. I said, what? I said, yeah, can have it. I opened it up, start to read the letters, and I just couldn't believe what I was reading. Absolute delight, shock, whatever. They were letters that my father had written in 1943 in the midst of the war. He had written to this future brother-in-law of his. I said, what's going on, Uncle? What's happened? I said, how on earth did you manage to keep these documents 57 years? You know, I was going crazy. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what I was talking about. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I took the letters back and read them, reread them, and my father's handwriting is very cursive, and it was very difficult for me to understand. But in one of the letters, he has an appended note, and the appended note is specifically directed at his future wife. They're not married yet. And I read the appended note, I read what he'd written, and, you know, emotions and everything come back, and I just could not believe what he had written. And it was specifically directed at his future wife, my mother. And I don't know if you want to read what my father had written. I've sent you a copy of that note, but it's written in Italian. I can read it for you.
Yeah,
or
you can read it, if you like.
Just let me bring it up. It's on the other. I've got to bring it up here. Sorry.
All right.
So let me bring this down a bit. Sorry,
All right.
got to try and bring this up on the computer. I might have to go here. Anyway, these letters were written in 1943. And my father's in the army at that time, and so he here we are. Goodness, I should have had this ready. Sorry.
Is this your letter? Well, there's one, I'm not sure all of them, but I've read, I think the one that
the one I'm referring to says
about your mother. Is that the one that
aggiunge questo mio biglietto?
Oh, that's the one, yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to bring it up.
Well, maybe I can do it. I do have it.
Okay, yep.
Aggiungo questo mio biglietto con I miei più cari baci, abbracci e carazzi. Saluti cari dai nostri di casa. Domenico vi saluta, mi ha scritto. Poi salutate tanto la mia adorata con affetto. That would be a reference to your mother, obviously.
That's the reference to his future wife.
Altro tanto, saluto la nostra e sua famiglia. Poi moltiplicate tutte le granelline del mare di sabbia, le stelle e gli uccelli dell'aria, e poi troverete la cifra di tanti baci e carazzi del vostro indimenticabile e affettuoso cognato, Agostino.
That's the one. Now, can you imagine in the middle of the war writing that to his beloved wife? But anyway, apart from that, there is another note. And the other note is written by a particular person called Avati, Giuseppe Avati.
Indeed.
And this Giuseppe Avati is the grandfather of the current Joe Avati, the comedian. And so my father and this Giuseppe Avati were in the army together. And of course, they're writing to each other. And this is the one of the notes that Joe's grandfather, Giuseppe Avati, writes, where he mentions that he's in his well, but there's been a particular bombardment is in Livorno at the particular stage. So Joe Avati, the current, the young Joe Avati now, the comedian, he didn't know about this.
No.
So when I found out that Joe Avati was a comedian, I got in touch with him many years ago. And I told him about this note, and I gave him this note. Of course, his grandfather now has passed away. And I think he was surprised as well to see that note from his grandfather. So his grandfather and my father were in the war together, in the army together. They were the same place, Cannavale, where they lived. And they're obviously very close and good friends. But the follow-on story to that is that when I came back in the year 2000, I went to my mother and I said, Mum, sit down. I said, do you know of any letters or anything that your husband may have written to you or other people in your family may have received and maybe should have passed on to you? And my mother said, no. Said, I've never heard of any letters or anything that that my future husband had written or anyone had given to me. And I said, not even later when you're in Australia? No. And so I wondered why my father perhaps didn't bring this up with my mother. And I guess one answer is easy, that, you know, in the calamity of the aftermath of the war, you don't say I wrote a letter, you know, so many years ago. When you're in Australia, they're struggling to make ends meet. So, no, my mother never knew this.
Yeah.
So I sat down with my mum and I read this note to my mum, and you can imagine tears flowing all over the place. And my mum was absolutely gobsmacked. She just couldn't believe that her husband had written, her future husband, had written this beautiful poem for her. And of course, my mum put it up in a frame all over the house. She rang every living relative to find out if there were more notes around the place, and I could never find any. So that's the note that I found, that my mother was what by then it was close to 60 years that he had written this letter for her.
It's amazing how history can be lost, isn't it, if it's not handed down from one generation to the other. I'm going to show you a photo if I can. Tell me, are you able to see that or not? No. Oh, there we go.
Okay. Oh, yes. Yes, I can see this photo. Now, my mother there is the middle one.
Yeah.
This is my older sister.
That would be that.
Yeah. This is me here.
That.
This is my next brother, Frank. And this is my next brother, Rock.
Right.
Now, we're all named after our relatives, of course. I'm named after my paternal, maternal, etc.
Well, that's, again, part of the custom, or it was anyway. It's no longer so.
Yes.
But it was not unusual to have three generations all with the same name.
Absolutely. Yes.
Now, what do your siblings do?
I think that's the first photo that I can ever remember having, because I think that was taken for passport requirements. I can be absolutely sure that we had no suits of that sort, and my younger brother never had a nice suit of that sort. That's 100% certain, because my mother used to say, we used to go around Gula de Fora.
So you think the photo's been touched up, do you?
I think the maybe the suits were there ready on hand,
right? So
for us to wear. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, good. That's good. Look, when did you? Well, you're retired now, aren't you?
I'm yes, retired in a sense. I'm an honorary professor, so I still maintain an office, and I still do research, and I still have PhD students who want to study with me, and I still enjoy doing all of that. So yes, in a sense, yes.
You're an emeritorious professor still at Victoria University.
Yes, I am.
But retired in the sense that there's no formal teaching load you have.
Absolutely. There's no formal teaching. There's no formal pay either.
I know. Tell me, when did you first go back to Italy?
Well, that's interesting, because at various stages, I tried to get an Italian passport, and I've been denied an Italian passport. I don't know why, but I think I know why now. I was called up for the Italian army when I was 19, and I refused to go. Refused in the sense that, you know, I had a life here. Why should I go there? And I was told that barred me from going back to Italy. It didn't bar me from going back to Italy. I was under I could have been called up to the army as soon as I put foot in Italy, and I needed special dispensation to go to Italy if I wanted to go, because of this fear of being called up in the army. So when I got married, my wife and I decided to have a a flying visit to Europe. But the trouble is that meant that I could be in trouble. So I had to get special dispensation from the consulate here, and I had to deliver that letter to my home community town before I could move around Italy. So we did that. We did that the first thing. So in 74 was the first time that I'd went back, but it was just a one-day visit to my local town hall, and off we went again. And I'd never been there. But since then, I've been back to Italy maybe 20, 30 times on lectures and talks.
When was the first time you spent some time in Italy?
The first extended period of time that we spent was in 1972, when I was on sabbatical in Pisa. There we took 2 or 3 weeks holidays, and we spent time with Luciana's family. They're from Foggia, and went back and visited, let's say, my area. Not that there was much to see where I come from. It's an old broken down place now, but I went back and saw a bit of it, and I've never been back since to my hometown. But lately, since you've put a lot of ideas in my head and sort of forced me in a way to look back, I do now have a hankering to go back to this particular farm that my father and my grandparents worked at. And I'd love one day to go back there. So whether that'll eventuate or not, I don't know. But since then, I've been back to Italy, as I said, maybe 20, 30 times. But it's mainly now visits to Tuscany, because we have some very good friends that we made on my first sabbatical that we're still friends with, and we often go back and see them. But I have a different view now of Italian people and Italy itself.
That's what I was going to ask you, whether you now, rekindle your affinity for Italians.
I have, in the sense that being older, being a parent, I understand there are some things that one grows up with, and one is part of that life, and one obtains those things through life. Now, it doesn't matter what part of the world you're from. Some of those things are good. Some of those things you don't understand. Some of those things change with life. Some things become modern. Some things stay as they are. And I can understand that the way the Italians and the Calabrese acted when they first came here. For them, it was comfort. It was what they knew. It was absolutely perfect for them. If you told one of those people that a priest was the font of all knowledge, you'd have to start World War III for them to change their idea. That was the way that they were. And I understand that, and I appreciate that. But I guess the big difference is that now there is education for everybody, whereas in those days, people were not, let's be honest, not educated. And so sometimes if not educated, it's a little bit more difficult to accept some things that are different. And I've been fortunate through my parents, who have always told us that education is important, to be able to accept everything. And I accept all those Italian customs, some which are crap, but there are others which are good. For example, lutto. I'm all for it. I'm for it. I think it's fantastic. So, yes, I've become accustomed, and I like those things. But it's funny, though, because our friends in northern Italy, they have different customs. And so they themselves would say that the Terrone, meaning the southerners, are stupid. They have all these stupid ideas and stupid customs. So it's not that you have to go from Italy to Australia to see a difference. You can go from one town to another town in Italy to notice that there's a difference. But for me these days, I absolutely appreciate everything.
You've got children of your own.
I've got children and grandchildren. Yes.
How many children do you have?
I have 4 children and 5 grandchildren now.
And are they in academia as well, or what do they do?
My children are all academically trained, yes, but none have gone into mathematics, probably to their benefit.
Well, I didn't want to compete.
And my oldest grandchild is, I think, 7, and he is showing a brilliant aptitude to, is unbelievably brilliant even at that age. He plays a violin that makes your skin want to stand on edge, and he's absolutely brilliant in some of the things that, let's say in the science area. I often say to him, I wish I was as smart as you when I was your age.
I'm sure you were. I'm sure you were. But obviously, you're what might be classified as a very obvious success story in terms of the experience that you had in Australia, and indeed also what might be called the typical progression rather than of the Calabrese, rather than what one reads or might read in the paper, where they're not doing anything positive. And again, I thank you for taking the time to share your experiences with us, and I hope you found it as helpful and interesting as I did. I think it's been a phenomenal time for me to have the opportunity to chat to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vincent, for this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it, because you spurred some memories which I'd really forgotten. And I'd really like to go out on a note that apparently my father, with this brother-in-law of his, Rocco, back from the war to pass their time, they used to serenade young ladies of their future husbands. So their future husband would employ my father and his future brother-in-law to serenade these ladies. And once I said to my father, where'd you get a guitar? Where'd you play? Che chitarra, che canzoni. They used to play two chords. So I'd like to go out on a tune that my parents and I think they used to play. So bear with me for 1 minute.
Absolutely.
So I used to say to my father, what did you play? What tunes did you play? Tune? Un pizzicarello, that's all we knew. A pizzicarello? What's a pizzicarello? So yeah. So they'd play this.
And they would sing.
I knew, and the other one would sing. And I said, well, what about if someone wanted a fast song? If there's a fast song, how did you play? O pizzicarello più forte. So they go. Same tune, but a bit faster. So thank you very much, Vincent.
Thank you, Tony. It's been a great privilege for me. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.